So everyone knows the story, or at least we think we do. A group of English pilgrims in crisp black clothing, their tall hats neatly adorned with shiny buckles, standing alongside friendly Native Americans dressed in fringed deerskin. The two groups sharing roast turkey, pumpkin pie, and cranberry sauce at a long wooden table in the golden glow of an autumn afternoon. It's a picture painted in countless school plays, holiday decorations, and storybooks. It's meant to be the origin story of American unity, a meal that brought two very different peoples together in peace and gratitude. But if you could actually walk the shores of Plymouth in the autumn of 1621, the scene you'd find would be far from that postcard-perfect image. There were no black-buckled hats, no sugar-sweet cranberry sauce, no steaming pies, and no grand sense of historical destiny. There was something else entirely: hunger, politics, trauma, and survival. The truth is both more human and more complicated than the legend. The first Thanksgiving wasn't a timeless celebration of brotherhood. It was a temporary alliance in a world filled with uncertainty. It was a meeting between two peoples, both recovering from devastation, both wary of each other, both needing something the other could provide. And like so many fleeting truces in history, it came with an expiration date. Tonight, we're going to walk through what actually happened: the world before the feast, the meeting itself, and what followed. By the time we're done, you'll see Thanksgiving not as the innocent holiday we've inherited, but as one of the most misunderstood moments in American history, a story wrapped in myth, but built on the raw realities of survival. Before we put anyone at the table, we have to see the world they were living in. The Wampanoag people had lived along the shores of what is now Massachusetts for thousands of years. Their villages stretched from Cape Cod westward, with carefully cultivated cornfields, fishing grounds, and seasonal hunting camps. They knew this land intimately, its tides, its seasons, its dangers. But by 1621, they were living in the aftermath of a disaster so great it had altered the balance of power across the entire region. Between 1616 and 1619, a mysterious plague swept through the coastal tribes of New England. European traders had been visiting these shores for decades, bringing iron tools, cloth, and weapons, but also bringing something else: disease. This particular epidemic, described in English records as a great sickness, may have been smallpox or leptospirosis or a combination of illnesses. Whatever it was, it killed fast, and it killed many, wiping out an estimated 2/3 to 3/4 of the Wampanoag population. Villages stood empty, fields lay untended. The survivors were left with grief and with a desperate need to defend what remained. And across the bay, the Narragansett, less affected by the epidemic, were growing stronger, watching their weakened neighbors closely. The Wampanoag were vulnerable. They needed allies. On the other side of this story were the newcomers, the English separatists we now call pilgrims. They had arrived in December of 1620 aboard the Mayflower, landing in a place they called Plymouth. But they hadn't chosen that location because it was untouched wilderness. They landed there because it was already cleared land, an abandoned Wampanoag village called Patuxet. The reason it was abandoned? Every inhabitant had died in the epidemic. The settlers arrived too late in the year to plant crops, and that first winter was brutal. They ran out of food, were weakened by scurvy, and buried their dead secretly at night, so the local tribes wouldn't see how few and fragile they were. By spring, half of them were gone. That was the world of 1621. Two peoples, both battered by recent loss, both wary of each other, both looking for a way forward, both knowing that survival in this land would not be possible without some kind of cooperation. Into this world stepped Massasoit Usamaquin, the sachem, or leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Massasoit was no fool. He knew the English were not going anywhere, and he also knew his people were too weakened to confront them by force, especially with the Narragansett watching for any sign of weakness. So he made a decision that would shape history. He would turn these strange newcomers into allies, not because he trusted them, and not because he believed they came as friends, but because they could be a shield against his enemies. The English had firearms, they had iron weapons, and they had the potential to be either the worst problem the Wampanoag had ever faced or a useful partner. In March of 1621, after cautious observation from the forest edges, Massasoit sent envoys. First came Samoset, a chief from Maine who astonished the settlers by walking into Plymouth and greeting them in English, a language he had learned from fishermen along the northern coast. A few days later, he returned with Tisquantum, better known to history as Squanto. Squanto's story is remarkable and tragic. Years earlier, he had been kidnapped by English traders, sold into slavery in Spain, found his way to England, learned the language, and finally returned home, only to find his entire village wiped out by the epidemic. Now, Squanto became the interpreter and go-between, helping arrange a formal meeting between Massasoit and the settlers. The treaty they signed was simple but crucial: mutual protection, mutual aid, and a promise not to harm each other. It was a pact of survival, a temporary solution in a dangerous world, and both sides understood that its strength would last only as long as both sides saw value in keeping it. Fast forward to the autumn of 1621. The settlers had made it through the summer, planted crops with Squanto's guidance, and brought in a decent harvest of corn, beans, and squash. They decided to celebrate, not in the way we think of Thanksgiving today, but in the English tradition of a harvest festival. This would last several days, include games, shooting matches, and plenty of food. The Wampanoag were not formally invited in the modern sense. Instead, they arrived around 90 men, mostly warriors. This wasn't just a friendly pop-in, it was a show of strength and a reinforcement of the alliance. Their presence doubled the number of people at Plymouth, and because the settlers hadn't prepared for such a large crowd, the Wampanoag went hunting. They brought back 5 deer, which became part of the feast. The menu was a far cry from our modern holiday table. There was cornmeal, porridge, squash, beans, perhaps some berries. From the English side, there was bread made from barley or rye and some meat from hunting expeditions, ducks, geese, and perhaps wild turkeys. There may have been fish and shellfish from the nearby coast, but there was no cranberry sauce. Sugar was rare and precious, and no pumpkin pie, since they had no wheat flour for crusts and no ovens to bake in. What they had was the food of necessity, prepared with the skill of people used to living off the land. For 3 days, they ate, played games, held shooting matches, and for a moment, lived in a fragile balance that would not last. It's tempting to imagine this as the beginning of a long and peaceful friendship, but history tells us otherwise. The treaty Massasoit forged held for a time, but the balance was delicate. The English kept growing in number, and they wanted more land to farm. At first, land was sometimes shared or purchased, at least in the English view. In the Wampanoag view, land was not owned in the European sense, and agreements about its use were not the same as giving it away forever. By the 1630s, new waves of English colonists arrived in Massachusetts Bay, outnumbering the Wampanoag and other local tribes many times over. Tensions rose. There were disputes over land, over hunting grounds, over resources. The peace treaty faded into the background. By 1675, only 54 years after that shared feast, war erupted. King Philip's War, named after Massasoit's son, Metacom, whom the English called Philip. It was one of the most devastating wars in American history in terms of population loss. Entire villages burned. Thousands died on both sides. Many native survivors were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The alliance that had begun in 1621 had not simply dissolved, it had shattered. And for the Wampanoag, the first Thanksgiving was not the beginning of a golden era. It was the prelude to one of the most destructive chapters in their history, a reminder that temporary alliances rarely protect against long-term ambitions. So, how did we get from a tense political harvest feast to the smiling, peaceful holiday image we know today? That transformation happened more than 200 years later. By the mid-1800s, the United States was a young but fractured nation, facing deep divisions over slavery. Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of Godey's Lady's Book and author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, began campaigning for a national Thanksgiving holiday. She saw it as a way to unite the country with a shared tradition. Hale romanticized the 1621 feast, portraying it as a moment of perfect harmony between Native Americans and English settlers. She glossed over the politics, the disease, the eventual wars, and the destruction of native lands. The story became a clean, simple fable, a nation's founding moment of gratitude and cooperation. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday, hoping to promote unity in a country tearing itself apart. Over time, the story solidified. Pilgrims, Indians, a big meal, and a moral about friendship. It was easier to tell this version than to confront the reality of colonization, displacement, and war. The myth served a purpose. It gave Americans a feel-good origin story that was simple, teachable, and comforting, even if it was far from the truth. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is not a celebration. It is a national day of mourning. Since 1970, Indigenous people have gathered at Coles Hill in Plymouth each Thanksgiving to remember the suffering and loss brought by colonization. The speeches, prayers, and ceremonies are not about rejecting gratitude itself, but about rejecting a false narrative that erases what really happened. For others, Thanksgiving has been reimagined as a time to gather with family, to give thanks for what they have, but with an awareness of the history beneath the holiday. The truth about 1621 doesn't make the day meaningless. If anything, it makes it more meaningful. The real feast was a moment of coexistence, carved out in the shadow of loss, a fragile pause in a world of uncertainty. Understanding that truth lets us honor not just the survival of the settlers, but the resilience of the Wampanoag and other native peoples who endured and still endure, despite centuries of hardship. Gratitude is still possible, but it's richer when it includes honesty, when it remembers not only the harvest, but also the cost at which it came. So the next time you picture that long wooden table, the smiling pilgrims, and the friendly Indians sharing turkey and pie, remember this: the real story is not a tale of unbroken peace. It's a human story of loss, of politics, of two peoples meeting in a moment where each needed the other to survive. It's a story that reminds us that history is never simple, and that the myths we build can be comforting, but they can also blind us. By telling the story whole, the feast, the plague, the politics, and the aftermath, we don't lose the meaning of Thanksgiving. We gain a deeper one. And perhaps, in knowing the truth, we can create new traditions of gratitude, ones that remember not only the harvest, but the hands and lives that made it possible.